She was left at the altar when her millionaire boss whispered, "Pretend I'm the groom." What seemed like a gesture of compassion revealed secrets that changed their lives forever. A story that will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, and comment on where you're watching from. The December sun beat down hard on the windows of St. Mary's Church in New York, casting golden reflections on the dark wooden pews that accommodated 300 restless guests. The sweet aroma of white roses, carefully arranged in cascades along the altar, mingled with the subtle perfume of the ladies in the front row and the palpable nervousness that hung in the air-conditioned sanctuary of the century-old church. Sarah Johnson adjusted her French lace veil for the 10th time, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly as she observed her reflection in the oval mirror held by the wedding planner. At 32, she possessed a serene and determined beauty, wavy brown hair styled in an elegant bun, honey-colored eyes reflecting sharp intelligence, and a straight posture that demonstrated years of early responsibility. Her dress, a mermaid-style gown in silk crepe, had cost 3 entire paychecks, but she considered the investment necessary for the most important day of her life. 15 minutes late, murmured Mrs. Smith, her mother, a 58-year-old woman with calloused hands from decades of working as a seamstress in Chinatown. She wore a navy blue dress that Sarah had insisted on buying, replacing the simpler model her mother had initially chosen. "Honey, that boy has always been a bit scatterbrained, but today—" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied moments of uncertainty. As an executive assistant at Johnson & Associates for 5 years, she had developed a reputation for solving impossible problems, anticipating needs before they were even verbalized, being the person everyone turned to when they needed efficiency and discretion. But behind that impeccable competence lay a deep and constant fear of never being truly valued for who she was, only for what she could do. "Maybe the traffic on Consolation Street is bad," she tried to justify, although she knew David always left with excessive anticipation. He was an accountant at a traditional firm downtown, a meticulous man who planned every move weeks in advance. They had met in a graduate course in business administration, and he had courted her with the gentle persistence of someone offering exactly what she thought she needed: stability, predictability, a life without great surprises. The murmur of the guests began low, like distant waves, but gradually grew louder. Sarah could distinguish the voices, her co-workers whispering in the middle rows, David's cousins fiddling with their phones, her college friends exchanging meaningful glances. 20 minutes, 25. Father Michael, who had known the Johnson family since Sarah was a child and attended catechism at this same church, approached with a comforting smile, but she saw the concern in his kind eyes. "Sarah, dear, would you like to try calling again?" She had already tried 6 times. The calls went straight to voicemail, and the messages on WhatsApp remained with just 1 tick, not even delivered. A cold sensation began to spread through her stomach, rising to her throat like a growing nausea. It was then that a familiar voice echoed behind her. "Sarah." She turned and found Michael Johnson standing at the entrance of the side chapel, impeccable in a dark grey Brooks Brothers suit that accentuated his 38 years of business success. Tall at 6'1", he had broad shoulders that betrayed years of swimming in his youth, black hair with a few silver streaks at the temples that gave him distinction, and dark brown eyes that alternated between the calculating coldness of business and a surprising warmth in rare moments of intimacy. His presence always altered the atmosphere of any room, a combination of natural authority, sharp intelligence, and a magnetism he rarely displayed deliberately. "Mr. Johnson?" Sarah felt her voice sound strange, higher than usual. "What are you doing here?" He walked toward her with measured steps, his gloved hands holding a white envelope. The expression on his face was a mix of contained anger and something she couldn't identify, an almost protective tenderness she had never seen in 5 years of working together. "David asked me to deliver this," he said, extending the envelope. His voice was softer than usual, devoid of the cutting authority he used in board meetings. Sarah opened the envelope with trembling fingers. The words danced before her tear-filled eyes. "I can't. I'm sorry. You deserve more than I can offer." It was David's handwriting, recognizable and cowardly in its brevity. The silence that followed was interrupted only by the sound of the air conditioning and the growing murmur of the guests, who were beginning to realize that something was terribly wrong. Sarah felt the world spin slightly, her legs weakening under the weight of the public humiliation unfolding before 300 pairs of eyes. Michael stepped closer, his solid presence like an anchor amidst the storm of emotions threatening to topple her. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and urgent in her ear. "Pretend I'm the groom." Sarah looked up to meet his gaze, finding unwavering determination in his eyes. For a moment, time seemed suspended between them, laden with years of shared work, mutual respect, and a professional dynamic that had always been impeccable but never personal. "What?" she whispered, certain she had misheard. "Marry me. Now. Here." His voice was firm, resolute. "I won't let you go through this humiliation. You deserve so much more." She thought it was a sign of jest or pity, but found only an absolute seriousness that left her even more confused. "Have you lost your mind?" she whispered, glancing quickly around to make sure no one had heard the insane proposal. This is madness, Mr. Johnson." "David," he gently corrected, his hands moving to delicately hold hers, which trembled almost imperceptibly. "And it's not madness. It's the only sensible solution to a situation that is about to become a public disaster." Mrs. Smith approached, her small, sharp eyes darting between her daughter and the elegant man she recognized from the few times she had visited Sarah's office. "Honey, what's going on? People are starting to get up." Indeed, some guests in the last rows were already whispering among themselves, discreet consultations to their phones, restless movements suggesting that the news of the abandonment was spreading like wildfire. Sarah could imagine the WhatsApp messages circulating. Sarah was left at the altar. Michael didn't show up. What a disaster, folks. Shame burned in her cheeks like a sudden fever. David turned to Mrs. Smith with the formal courtesy he reserved for important meetings. "Mrs. Smith, I'm David Johnson, Sarah's boss. I would like to ask for your permission to marry your daughter today, right now." The older woman's jaw dropped slightly. "What did you say, my son?" "Mom," Sarah quickly interjected, her voice still low but gaining firmness. "Michael, he's not coming. He sent a letter." Mrs. Smith read the letter, quickly, her expression shifting from confusion to a mix of anger and disappointment. "That cowardly boy," she murmured, then looked at David with a sharp maternal assessment. "And you want to marry my daughter just like that?" "Not just like that," David replied, his voice gaining an intensity that Sarah had never heard before. "I've known Sarah for 5 years. I know she is intelligent, dedicated, loyal. I know she deserves to be treated with respect. And I know that right now she needs someone who won't let her face alone the humiliation that coward is causing." Sarah felt something, strange stir in her chest, a mix of gratitude, confusion, and a recognition she wasn't prepared to name. In 5 years of working together, she had seen David negotiate million-dollar contracts, face political adversaries, lead a company with over 500 employees. But she had never seen him look at anyone the way he was looking at her now. Father Michael approached discreetly, his voice low and paternal. "Sarah, dear, perhaps it's best if we cancel the ceremony for today. We can reschedule when you feel—" "No." The word came out stronger than Sarah intended. She looked around, at the floral arrangements that had cost a fortune, at the altar where she had dreamed of saying yes to the love of her life, at the guests who were beginning to whisper more intensely. "I'm not cancelling. I won't give him that satisfaction." David smiled for the first time since he had arrived, a small but genuine smile. "So, do you accept?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the scent of the roses mix with his subtle cologne, something woody and elegant that she had noticed hundreds of times in the office elevator without ever admitting she found it attractive. She thought of the life she had planned with Michael, paid-off apartment in 20 years, kids by 35, secure retirement, a predictable life, without great passions or great disappointments. "What are the terms?" she asked, her analytical mind taking control even amid the emotional chaos. The question seemed to surprise him. "Terms? It's an arrangement, isn't it? A convenience contract to save me from public humiliation." She kept her voice steady, professional. "I want to know what the expectations are, the limits, the duration." David studied her face for a long moment, and she saw something pass through his eyes. Perhaps disappointment, perhaps respect. "We can discuss the details later. For now, you need to decide if you trust me enough to let me help you." "Sarah," Mrs. Smith interjected, placing a loving hand on her daughter's arm. "Are you sure? This is very big, very fast." Sarah looked at her mother, a woman who had worked 12 hours a day for 15 years to pay for her education, who had saved every penny to buy the navy blue dress she wore today, who deserved to see her daughter happy and respected. Then she looked at David, trying to decipher the motivations behind the proposal. He was known for his calculated coldness in business, but also for his impeccable word. If he was offering this, he had his reasons. "Why are you doing this?" she asked directly. David hesitated for a fraction of a second, a moment of vulnerability that she picked up immediately. "Because you don't deserve to go through this alone, and because—" He paused, as if struggling with the words. "Because for a long time I should have said that you are worth so much more than any man who abandons you at the altar." The sincerity in his voice hit her like a punch to the stomach. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she held them back with the willpower she had developed over years of being the responsible daughter, the reliable employee, the woman who never let anyone down. "All right," she finally said, her voice firm despite the storm in her heart. "I accept." Father Michael blinked several times, as if trying to process what he had just heard. At 67, he had presided over hundreds of weddings, but never a situation like this. He looked from Sarah to David, then to Mrs. Smith, who held her daughter's hand with protective strength. "My daughter," he said gently, "marriage is a sacred sacrament. It cannot be decided on impulse or by circumstances." "Father," David respectfully interrupted, "I understand your concern. But Sarah and I are not strangers. We have worked together for years. We know each other. We respect each other. And I can promise that she will be treated with all the dignity and care she deserves." Sarah felt a wave of warmth rise up her neck. The way he had said that word, care, carried an intimacy she hadn't expected. She looked at him more closely, noticing details that usually went unnoticed. The small scar on his left eyebrow, the subtle lines around his eyes that appeared when he genuinely smiled, the way his large hands moved with calculated precision. "But the documents, the eligibility," Father Michael continued, clearly worried about the legal aspects. "I have the birth certificate and the documents in the car," Sarah said, surprising herself with her practicality. "Michael and I arranged everything last week. The names can be changed at the registry office later." David took his wallet out of the inner pocket of his blazer, retrieving his documents. "Mine are here. We can sort out the paperwork today, if necessary." The murmurs from the guests had intensified considerably. Sarah could hear fragments of conversations. "What's happening? Where's Michael? Is she crying?" Some people had already stood up, checking their phones, and she saw at least 3 guests discreetly walking toward the exit. "I need to speak with both of you privately," Father Michael said, indicating the sacristy. "Mrs. Smith, could you explain to the congregation that there will be a slight delay, let's say 5 minutes, to sort out some documentation issues? In the sacristy, a small and cozy space with the scent of incense and aged wood." Father Michael closed the door and turned to them with a serious expression. "Sarah, I baptized you. I watched you grow. I celebrated your first communion. Are you absolutely sure this is what you want? Not out of wounded pride or to avoid embarrassment, but because you truly believe you can be happy?" The question hit Sarah like a sharp blade. She looked at David, who remained silent, his gloved hands crossed behind his back, waiting for her response without pressuring her. "Father," she began, her voice initially hesitant but gaining strength, "I have never been the type to act on impulse. I always think through each decision 10 times before executing. And Michael—" She swallowed hard. "Michael offered me security, predictability, but he never made me feel special. He never looked at me as if I really mattered." She turned to David, finding his dark brown eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her blush. "You know me differently. You know when I'm stressed because I bring too much coffee to the office. You know I hate Monday morning meetings because I need to organize the whole week beforehand. You know I struggle to delegate because—" She paused, realizing she was revealing more than she intended. "Because you don't trust that people will do things with the same care that you do," David gently completed. "And because you are afraid of not being indispensable, of not being valued if you're not useful all the time." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He truly knew her, more than Michael did in 2 years of dating. Father Michael observed the exchange between them with experienced eyes. "And you, David, why are you willing to marry Sarah today like this, without time for reflection?" David was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from the wall with old crucifixes to the priest's face, finally resting on Sarah. "Because I have admired her for much longer than I should admit," he said, his voice low but clear. "Because she is the most competent and dedicated person I have ever met, but also because—" He hesitated as if struggling with a confession. "Because when she genuinely smiles, not the polite smile she uses in meetings, but the real smile that appears when she solves a complex problem or when someone acknowledges her work, she lights up the whole room." Sarah felt her face heat up. She didn't know he had noticed the difference between her smiles. "And because," David continued, "she deserves so much more than to be abandoned by a man who doesn't even have the courage to end a relationship in person. She deserves to be valued, protected, respected. If I can offer that, even if it starts as a practical arrangement, then it's worth it." Father Michael studied the two for a moment longer, then sighed deeply. "Sarah, do you understand that this marriage, once performed, will be real in the eyes of God and the law? It is not a theatrical representation." "I understand," Sarah replied firmly. "And do both of you understand that marriage requires commitment, patience, forgiveness, and mutual growth?" "Yes," they answered in unison. The priest nodded slowly. "Then may God bless you both. Let's turn this day of sadness into a day of new hope. But first," He looked directly at David. "You need a ring." David smiled for the second time that morning, pulling a small dark blue velvet box from his pocket. "I brought my grandmother's ring. It has belonged to the Johnson family for 3 generations. If Sarah accepts—" Sarah looked at the box, then at him. "How did you—" "I always carry it with me," he said simply. "She was very special to me." Sarah held the small velvet box with trembling hands, feeling the weight of the history it carried. When she opened it, it revealed a white gold ring with delicate filigree details, not ostentatious, but clearly a family piece, filled with tradition and artisanal care. It was different from anything she had imagined for herself, more elegant and sophisticated than the simple ring Michael had chosen. "It's beautiful," she whispered, gently touching the cold metal. "But a family ring, isn't that too significant for a temporary arrangement?" David stepped closer, his presence filling the small space of the sacristy. "My grandmother always said that rings, they carry the blessings of those who came before. Regardless of how our situation began, I want you to have the best blessings possible." Father Michael observed the interaction with growing interest. In decades of ministry, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when genuine feelings existed under complicated circumstances. "Very well," he said, "let's proceed. Sarah, do you need a few minutes to mentally adjust to the situation?" She took a deep breath, quickly looking at herself in the small mirror of the sacristy. Her makeup had held up well under the emotional stress. A professional choice she made for important meetings and apparently also for marital emergencies. The wedding dress was impeccable, the veil still perfectly positioned. On the outside, she looked exactly like a bride should look. On the inside, she felt as if she were jumping out of a plane without being sure if the parachute would work. "I'm ready," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. When they left the sacristy, the scene at the altar had changed. Mrs. Smith had clearly managed the situation with the efficiency of someone accustomed to solving practical problems. The guests were seated, but there was a different energy in the air, anticipation mixed with confusion and a hint of excitement over the unexpected drama. "Dear friends and family," Father Michael began, his voice echoing through the stone walls of the centuries-old church. "Sometimes life presents us with situations that test our faith and our ability to adapt. Today, instead of witnessing the wedding you expected, you will witness something equally sacred and meaningful." The low murmuring ceased immediately. Sarah could feel 300 pairs of eyes fixed on her and Michael, who had positioned himself beside her with the ease of someone used to commanding high-pressure situations. Sarah Johnson and Michael Johnson have decided to unite their lives in matrimony today, here, before God and all of you. Although the decision may seem sudden to many, the love and respect they have for one another have been built over years of companionship and mutual admiration. Sarah felt Michael intertwine his fingers with hers. His hands were larger than Raphael's, more calloused, a sign that despite his wealth, he was not unfamiliar with physical work. The grip was firm without being possessive, comforting without being condescending. "Michael," Father Michael continued, "do you take Sarah as your lawful wife, promising to love her, respect her, and protect her in joy and in sorrow, in health and in sickness, in wealth and in poverty, all the days of your life?" Michael turned to Sarah, and for a moment she saw beyond the professional mask he always wore. There was vulnerability there, a cautious hope she had never noticed before. "Yes, I do," he said, his voice clear and firm, echoing through the church. "Sarah, do you take Michael as your lawful husband, promising to love him, respect him, and support him in joy and in sorrow, in health and in sickness, in wealth and in poverty, all the days of your life?" The moment stretched into what felt like hours. Sarah looked at Michael, really looked, and saw a man who had built a business empire through hard work and smart decisions, but who was now offering all of that to protect her from public humiliation. A man who knew her professional quirks, who had noticed her different types of smiles, who carried his grandmother's ring in his pocket as a talisman of hope. "Yes, I do," she said, and was surprised by the conviction in her own voice. When Michael slid the grandmother's ring onto her ring finger, Sarah felt an electricity course through her arm. The ring fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. He had also brought a simple white gold band for himself, which she slid onto his finger with only slightly trembling hands. "By the power vested in me by the Holy Church, I declare you husband and wife," Father Michael pronounced solemnly. "What God has joined, let no man separate." Tradition dictated that the groom kiss the bride, but Sarah and Michael hesitated, aware that they were navigating unknown territory. It was he who took the initiative, leaning in to give a chaste kiss on her forehead, a gesture of respect and protection that somehow felt more intimate than a traditional kiss on the lips. The applause that echoed through the church was different from what Sarah had imagined for her wedding. It was more cautious, punctuated by exclamations of surprise and whispered conversations, but there was also a genuine warmth from those who knew her and wanted her happiness. Mrs. Smith was the first to embrace them, tears in her eyes. "My daughter," she whispered in her ear, "this man has kind eyes. Trust your heart." As they walked down the center aisle of the church, arms intertwined, Sarah observed the reactions of the guests. Her colleagues seemed impressed and slightly envious. They all knew Michael Johnson by reputation. Raphael's friends looked confused and a bit embarrassed. Her cousins and uncles whispered among themselves, clearly trying to process the dramatic turn of events. But it was when they reached the entrance of the church, where the photographer was still waiting in confusion, that the reality of the situation hit her completely. She was married to her boss, a man she respected professionally, but who remained in many ways a mystery to her. "And now?" she asked softly as they posed for a few quick photos. "Now," Michael replied, his hand resting lightly on her back, "we're going to make this day memorable for the right reasons." The soft sound of the string quartet continued playing, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Sarah observed everything with a surreal feeling of living someone else's life. The waiters circulated with trays of shrimp scampi and codfish fritters, exactly as she had planned. The tables were arranged precisely as she had sketched on paper months ago, but instead of being next to Michael receiving predictable congratulations, she was next to David, who greeted each guest with the natural courtesy of someone accustomed to high-level social events. "Sarah!" exclaimed Juliana, her closest colleague from the office, approaching with wide eyes of curiosity. "Girl, I need to understand what happened. You and David. Since when?" Sarah felt her face heat up. She had mentally rehearsed some explanations during the drive from the church to the venue, but none seemed convincing now that she needed to verbalize them. "It's complicated," she began, searching for the right words. "Actually," David gently interjected, placing his hand protectively on Sarah's back, "it's not complicated. Sarah and I have developed feelings for each other over the years working together. When the situation changed today, we realized it was time to be honest about our feelings." The explanation flowed from his lips with impressive naturalness, and Sarah wondered if he had practiced during the drive or if he simply possessed the kind of presence of mind that made him so effective in business. "But you never showed," Juliana insisted, clearly fascinated by the drama. "Some things are private until the right moment," David replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, politely closing the subject. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah began to notice details that surprised her. David knew the names of all the vendors, the florist, the photographer, the catering team. When she commented on this, he casually explained, "I wanted to make sure your plans were respected. I contacted them yesterday to confirm all the details you had organized." Yesterday? Sarah stopped walking, forcing him to stop as well. "How did you know yesterday that—" David fell silent for a moment, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her momentarily forget where they were. "I didn't know. But I hoped." Before she could fully process this revelation, Mrs. Smith approached accompanied by an elegant lady whom Sarah did not recognize. "Dear," said Mrs. Smith, her voice carrying a tone of nervousness that Sarah knew well, "this is Mrs. Helena, David's mother." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Helena Johnson was an impressive woman, tall, with perfectly styled grey hair in a chignon, wearing a navy linen suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary. Her blue eyes, from which David had obviously inherited intensity, assessed Sarah with the precision of a scanner. "Sarah," said Helena, extending her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "What a surprise. Interesting." "Mrs. Johnson," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's a pleasure to meet you." "Mother," David quickly interjected. "I know this is unexpected, but Sarah is an extraordinary woman. You will love her when you get to know her better." Helena studied her son with experienced eyes. "I'm sure," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "David has always had interesting judgment when it comes to impulsive decisions." The tension in the small group was palpable. Sarah could feel Mrs. Smith stiffening beside her. Her mother had developed a keen instinct for detecting condescension after decades of working for wealthy families. "Excuse me," said Helena softly. "I need to make a few calls. This development requires some adjustments to the family's plans." As she walked away, Mrs. Smith whispered to Sarah, "This one is going to be trouble, dear." The rest of the party passed in a haze of forced conversations and tense smiles. Sarah watched David navigate between groups with professional ease, greeting colleagues, distant relatives, and even some of Michael's friends who had decided to stay. He had a natural ability to make each person feel heard and valued, a talent she had observed in business meetings but never in a social context. By around 7 in the evening, as the sun began to set over the buildings of Greenwich Village, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, most of the guests had left. Sarah found herself sitting at one of the empty tables, watching the cleaning crew gather the last remnants of the strangest party of her life. David approached, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've lived an entire month in one day," she replied honestly, accepting the glass. "And you? This can't have been exactly how you planned to spend your Saturday." He chuckled softly, a genuine sound she rarely heard in the office. "Definitely not a typical Saturday. But I don't regret it." Sarah studied his face in the golden light of the late afternoon. "Why did you do this? The truth, David. Why did you risk your reputation, your organized life, to help me?" He fell silent for a long moment, swirling the glass between his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more vulnerable than she was used to hearing. "Because you shine, Sarah. Not just at work, although you are brilliant professionally. You shine as a person, and seeing someone like Michael treat that with disdain, abandoning you at the altar as if you were disposable." He shook his head, the contained anger still evident. "You deserve to be valued. You deserve to be protected. And if I can be the one to do that, even if starting as a practical arrangement, then it's worth any complication." Sarah felt something stir in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the champagne. For the first time since the morning, she allowed herself to truly look at David as something beyond his. She saw a man who had risked everything to protect her, who had paid attention to the details that mattered. to her who knew her better than she had realized. "And now?" she asked softly. "What do we do now?" 2 weeks after the most surreal wedding in New York, Sarah was sitting in her apartment in Upper East Side, watching the ring of Michael's grandmother reflect the morning light streaming through the living room window. The two-bedroom apartment, which she had proudly purchased 3 years earlier, felt strangely small now that it bore the weight of being the home of a married woman. The aroma of brewing coffee in the kitchen mingled with the distant sound of fireworks from the upcoming 4th of July celebrations that were starting to take over the city. The routine had established itself in a strangely and curiously comfortable way. Michael had insisted on maintaining separate residences to preserve your privacy and give us time to adjust to the situation, he had explained, with the polite formality he used for delicate matters. But he showed up every morning to pick her up for work, and they had developed the habit of dining together 3 times a week, always at discreet restaurants or social events where their presence as a couple was expected. Sarah was flipping through a stack of mail that had accumulated when she found a thick envelope with the logo of the bank where Michael's friend worked. Inside, a notification that made her stomach drop. She had been listed as a co-signer on 3 loans totaling $180,000, debts she had never authorized or even knew about. "Son of a bitch," she whispered. A word she rarely used, but that came out naturally in the face of the betrayal uncovered. The dates on the contract showed that Michael had forged her signature during the last 6 months of their relationship, using copies of documents he had access to as her ex-fiancé. The phone rang, interrupting her furious thoughts. "Sarah, it's Michael. Are you okay? Your voice sounds strange." She hadn't even realized she had answered in a different tone. "Michael, I need to talk to you. It's about Michael. I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, Michael was in her living room, reading the documents with an increasingly grim expression. He was wearing dark jeans and a white polo shirt, the first time Sarah had seen him in casual clothes, and she was surprised by how much younger and more approachable he looked, though still impressively attractive. "That bastard," he murmured, using a curse word that sounded shocking coming from someone usually so controlled. He planned this. The abandonment at the altar was just the end of a much larger scheme. "What do you mean?" Michael stood up and began to pace the small room, his contained energy filling the space. "Think about it. He accumulates debts in your name for months, then disappears on the wedding day, leaving you responsible for debts you didn't incur, without the financial support of a husband and with your reputation tarnished. If you tried to go after him legally, it would be your word against his regarding the forged signatures." The cold, calculating nature of the situation hit Sarah like a bucket of cold water. "But why? Why do this to me?" "Money," Michael said simply. "With $180,000, he can buy a stake in the accounting firm where he works. The senior partner is about to retire." Sarah sat heavily on the sofa, feeling the weight of the betrayal. It wasn't just abandonment, it was theft, manipulation, a deliberate destruction of her financial stability. "I can fix this," Michael said softly, sitting down beside her. "I can pay off the debts, hire lawyers to go after him criminally." "No." The response came out firmer than she expected. "I will not be another burden for you. I've done that. I've accepted being rescued once. I won't make it a habit." Michael studied her carefully. "Sarah, accepting help is not weakness, especially when the help comes from someone who—" "Who what?" she asked, turning to face him directly. He fell silent for a long moment, conflict visible on his face. "From someone who cares about you." The simplicity of the statement hit her, harder than elaborate words. Sarah felt something stir in her chest, a warmth that went beyond gratitude. "Why do you care about me, Michael?" she asked softly. "And don't tell me it's because I'm a good employee." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking at their intertwined hands. "Do you want the honest truth?" "Always." "I fell in love with you 3 years ago," he said, his voice low but clear. "It was in a meeting about the residential complex project in Jersey City. You were presenting the feasibility analysis, and there was an error in the external consultant's numbers, an error that could have cost millions for the company. You not only found the mistake, but had prepared 3 alternative solutions, each with complete risk and return projections." Sarah remembered the meeting. She had spent 2 sleepless nights reviewing every number. "But it wasn't just the competence," Michael continued. "It was when you finished the presentation and said, 'I know this may seem overly cautious, but I prefer to be right than to be sorry.' You were protecting the company, protecting the jobs of everyone who depended on that project succeeding. And then you blushed because you thought you had said too much." She remembered that too, the feeling of having exposed herself too much in a room full of executives. "At that moment, I realized you weren't just smart or dedicated, you were special, and I spent 3 years trying to find a way to say that, without compromising our professional relationship, without putting you in an awkward position." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "And then the perfect opportunity to save me came up." "No," he said firmly, finally looking at her. "The perfect opportunity to finally be honest about how I feel." The silence that followed was charged with a different kind of tension, no longer the discomfort of an awkward situation, but the electricity of unexplored possibilities. "David," she began, but was interrupted by the ring of her cell phone. It was a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the familiar voice made her freeze. "Sarah, it's Michael. I need to talk to you." Michael's voice over the phone sounded different, less confident, with a desperate tone that Sarah had never heard before. David, who was close enough to hear, discreetly gestured towards the phone, suggesting she put it on speaker. "Michael," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions, "you have a lot of nerve calling after what you did." "Sarah, I know you must be furious, but I need to explain. It wasn't what it seemed. I panicked. You left me at the altar," she interrupted, watching David lean forward, attentive to every word. "In front of 300 people, including my mother, who saved for months to buy a new dress. I know it was terrible, but listen." His voice grew more urgent. "I heard. You married David Johnson. Sarah, you don't understand who this man is. He's not what he seems." Sarah felt David stiffen beside her. "What are you implying?" "He has a reputation in the business world, Sarah. He's known to be calculating, ruthless. Do you really think he married you for love? He must have some interest, some plan." "Interesting," David's voice cut through the air as Sarah put the phone on speaker. "Coming from someone who forged signatures to steal $180,000 from his own fiancée." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for long seconds. "David," Michael finally said, his voice visibly shaken, "is that you?" "It is. And I'm curious to know how you're going to explain the debts you incurred in Sarah's name without her consent." That was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding that requires handwriting analysis to clarify," David asked, his voice taking on the icy tone Sarah recognized from the tensest meetings. "Because that's exactly what we're going to do." Sarah watched David take control of the situation with the surgical precision of an experienced predator. There was something fascinating and slightly terrifying about how easily he dismantled Michael's pathetic attempts to justify himself. "Michael," Sarah interjected, finding a strength in her voice she didn't know she possessed, "do you want to know the difference between you and David? You abandoned me at the worst moment of my life. He showed up. You stole my money and my trust. He protected my dignity. You're calling now probably because some plan of yours went wrong and you need me back. He never made me feel like I was a plan B. Sarah, you're making a huge mistake. This marriage is a sham, and when you find out the truth, David said calmly, is that you took out fraudulent loans, abandoned an extraordinary woman at the altar, and now you're trying to manipulate her into coming back because your plans didn't turn out as you hoped. Should I assume the partnership at the accounting firm didn't materialize as planned? Again, revealing silence. How do you... Because, unlike you, I actually care about Sarah's well-being, which includes finding out exactly what you did and why. Sarah felt a mix of impression and gratitude. David had investigated the situation, not to control or manipulate her, but to protect her. Listen, Michael's voice grew, more desperate. Sarah, you've known me for 2 years. You know my family, my dreams. This guy is a rich stranger who's using you for some game you don't understand. You're right about one thing, Sarah said, surprising both men. David is wealthy, successful, and I don't completely understand his motivations. She looked directly at David as she continued. But he knows me. He knows I hate Monday morning meetings, knows I bring too much coffee when I'm anxious, knows I'd rather be right than regretful. In 2 years, you never noticed those things about me. Sarah, more importantly, she continued, her voice gaining strength, he treats me like I'm valuable, not useful, valuable, and after what you did, that's a difference I won't ignore anymore. You'll regret this, Michael said, his tone shifting to something darker, when you find out what kind of man he really is. Is that a threat? David asked, his voice dangerously low. It's a warning. The call ended, leaving Sarah and David in silence in the small, cozy room. The sound of fireworks from the summer festivities echoed distantly through the windows, a reminder that life continued happening while they dealt with the wreckage of the past. Do you believe what he said, Sarah finally asked, about you having hidden motives? David turned to face her completely. Do you want to know if I have motives beyond protecting you and, well, beyond the feelings I confessed? I do. Yes, he said simply. I do. Sarah's heart sank a little, but she kept her expression neutral. What motives? I want you to love me, he said, his honesty cutting like a blade. I want this marriage, which started as a desperate rescue, to become real. I want to wake up beside you and know that you chose to be there, not because I saved you from an embarrassing situation, but because you want to be there. The declaration hit her like lightning. It was both the most romantic and the most terrifying thing anyone had ever said to her. Does that scare you? He asked, correctly interpreting her expression. It terrifies me, she admitted, because I'm starting to want the same thing, and I don't know if I'm ready for that. The summer in New York arrived with its characteristic intensity, and Sarah found herself in completely unfamiliar territory, not only emotionally but also socially. The New Year's party hosted by the construction company, traditionally held at the St. Mary's Church Hall, was an event she had always organized behind the scenes, never attending as the main guest. Now, as the wife of the CEO, she was at the center of an attention that left her both fascinated and uncomfortable. The dress that David had insisted on buying for her, a midi model in navy silk with embroidered details, cost more than her monthly salary, but she admitted that she felt powerful wearing it. Standing on the terrace of the hall, observing the panoramic view of the city sparkling with golden lights and distant fireworks, she tried to process how her life had changed so drastically in just 2 weeks. You look beautiful, David said, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. He wore a tuxedo that seemed to have been made specifically for him. It probably had been, and Sarah had to admit that the sight of him dressed formally still affected her in ways she wasn't quite ready to analyze. Thank you, she replied, accepting the glass. I'm still getting used to all of this. The dress? The event? Or being treated as you deserve? The question contained an intimacy that made her blush slightly. In recent days, they had developed a new dynamic, still respectful and careful, but charged with a growing tension that neither seemed ready to name completely. Sarah! A shrill female voice cut through the moment. They turned to see Jessica Brown, the wife of one of the minority partners of the construction company, approaching with the predatory smile that Sarah recognized well from office social gatherings. What a surprise to see you here as a guest, instead of organizing everything behind the scenes. Sarah felt David stiffen almost imperceptibly beside her, but his voice remained perfectly polite as he replied, "Jessica, it's great to see you. Sarah has always been beyond her professional roles. Now we are just being more open about it." "Of course," Jessica said, her smile becoming sharper. "It must be so interesting for you, Sarah, to discover what life is like for, well, people in our social position." The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and Sarah felt something harden in her chest. Not humiliation, as Jessica expected, but a cold, calculated anger. "Actually," Sarah replied with an equally sweet smile, "it's fascinating to observe how some people confuse inherited wealth with genuine class. It's a truly revealing anthropological study." Jessica blinked several times, clearly not expecting such a direct response. David suppressed a smile behind his champagne glass. "Well," Jessica said, recovering quickly, "I suppose we all have our origins." "True," David gently interjected. "Sarah's origins include an extraordinary work ethic, sharp intelligence, and the ability to solve problems that others consider impossible. Those are origins any family should be proud of." The defense was polite but firm, and Sarah felt something stir in her chest, not just gratitude, but a deeper warmth for how he had protected her without making her seem fragile. After Jessica walked away with murmured apologies, Sarah and David remained silent for a few moments, watching the distant fireworks light up the New York sky. "Thank you," she finally said. "For what?" "For standing up for me without making it seem like I needed to be defended." David smiled, a genuine smile that she was learning to distinguish from the polite smiles he used in social situations. "You didn't need to be defended. You were doing perfectly well on your own. I just wanted to make it clear where I stand." "And where do you stand?" The question came out more directly than she had planned, laden with all the unresolved tension that had grown between them in recent weeks. David turned to face her completely, his dark eyes reflecting the golden lights of the party behind them. "Completely on your side, Sarah. In every situation, against anyone. Always." The intensity in his voice made her realize they were moving into new and dangerous territory. For weeks, they had maintained careful courtesy, respecting the boundaries of their unconventional arrangement. But now, under the soft lights of the terrace and with the distant sound of music and conversation, something was changing. "David," she began, but was interrupted by the approach of another couple. "David, Sarah!" The voice belonged to Charles Anderson, an Argentine businessman who had moved to New York years earlier. He was accompanied by a stunning woman, tall, with blonde hair and a dress that probably cost more than Sarah's car. "Charles," David greeted cordially. "How are things in Buenos Aires?" As the men talked business, Sarah found herself studying Charles's companion. There was something familiar about her, a natural elegance that went beyond money or physical beauty. "You must be Sarah," the woman said in English, with a charming Argentine accent. "I'm Isabella Martinez. Charles told me about your interesting marriage." Sarah felt an alert go off in her mind. "Interesting?" "Well," Isabella smiled, but there was something calculating in her eyes. It must be unique to marry the boss so suddenly, especially considering David's history with convenience relationships. The comment was like a cold slap. History? Oh dear, Isabella continued with false innocence. You didn't know? David is famous for his practical arrangements. There was that socialite from Washington, the heiress of the Anderson family, always relationships that somehow benefit the business. Sarah felt the ground shift slightly beneath her feet. She looked at David, who had stopped talking to Charles and was watching the interaction with an expression she couldn't decipher. Isabella has a very creative imagination, David said calmly, but there was a tension in his voice that Sarah immediately picked up on. Imagination. Isabella laughed, a sound that managed to be both musical and poisonous. Darling half of Adaptosoys, Isabella Thompson, Buenos Aires, Los Angeles, New York knows about your strategic relationships. It's part of your charm. You've always been so efficient at combining business with pleasure. The silence that followed Isabella's comment was heavy as lead. Sarah felt as if the ground was disintegrating beneath her feet, but she maintained a carefully neutral expression, a skill learned over years of difficult meetings where showing emotion meant losing power. Isabella, David said, his voice taking on a cold tone that Sarah recognized from the tensest negotiations, always so interested in other people's lives. How are your own arrangements in Los Angeles? The woman blushed slightly, but kept her venomous smile, touching David, always so protective of your acquisitions. The word acquisitions hit Sarah like a slap. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold anger she had learned to channel professionally. Isabella, Sarah said with a perfectly polite smile, it's fascinating how some people confuse genuine interest with malicious gossip. It must be a cultural difference. Dear, Isabella replied condescendingly, I just think you should know what you're getting into. David has a pattern, useful women who serve his interests until what? Sarah interrupted, her voice still controlled, but gaining a firmness that made Isabella hesitate. Well, until they are no longer useful. Charles, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, tried to intervene. Isabella, perhaps we should... No, Sarah said firmly, her eyes fixed on Isabella. Let her finish. I'm curious to know what evidence she has for such specific accusations. Isabella blinked, clearly not expecting to be confronted directly. Well, it's public knowledge. Public knowledge based on what exactly? Documents, witnesses, or just the kind of malicious gossip that circulates in certain circles when people have too much free time and little character? Sarah's tone was perfectly polite, but there was a sharpness to it that made Isabella recoil slightly. Sarah, David began, but she discreetly raised her hand, asking to finish. Because I'm going to tell you something about public knowledge, Isabella, Sarah continued, her smile remaining sweet as her words gained strength. I've been working for 5 years at one of the largest construction companies in the country. I know how business works, the strategic relationships, the alliances. And if David were really the kind of man who uses people and discards them, I would know, not because I'm naive, but because I'm very good at what I do, and what I do includes assessing character and motivations. Isabella was visibly uncomfortable now, her smile becoming forced. More importantly, Sarah added, stepping closer to the woman, if he were that kind of man, I wouldn't be here. Not because I'm a helpless victim who needs saving, but because I have standards, and my standards don't include men who treat people like commodities. The terrace had gone silent around them. Sarah realized her voice had risen slightly, drawing the attention of other guests. So, she concluded, returning to a conversational tone, thank you for your concern, but I can take care of myself, and now, if you'll excuse me, I would like to dance with my husband." Without waiting for a response, Sarah turned to David and extended her hand. "Dance with me?" David looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, a mix of admiration, surprise, and something deeper that made her heart race. "It would be an honor," he said, taking her hand. As they walked to the dance floor, Sarah could feel the curious gazes of the other guests. The orchestra played a soft waltz, and when David pulled her into his arms, she felt a surprising familiarity, as if they had danced together hundreds of times before. "Thank you," he murmured in her ear as they moved to the rhythm of the music. "For what?" "For standing up for me, for trusting me enough to defend me." Sarah looked into his eyes, seeing the genuine vulnerability there. "I trust you," she said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "I don't know when that happened, but I trust." "Even after what Isabella said?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "David, I've worked with you for 5 years. I've seen you deal with employees, clients, suppliers. I've seen you fire people when necessary and promote others when they deserved it. I've seen you make tough decisions and make sacrifices for your employees. If you were the kind of person Isabella described, I would have seen signs." They danced in silence for a few moments, the music enveloping them as other couples joined the floor. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah finally said. "Anything. Were there other women? Strategic relationships?" David didn't answer immediately, and Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "There were," he finally said, his honesty cutting. "2 serious relationships that had mutual benefits. One was the daughter of a prominent politician, which facilitated some licensing. The other was from a family with international connections that helped our expansion." Sarah felt a pang of something that could be jealousy, but forced herself to remain rational. And did they know that the relationships had these benefits? Yes, they were mutual arrangements. They also gained something: status, connections, financial security. There was no deception. "And did you love any of them?" The question came out more vulnerable than Sarah intended. David stopped dancing for a moment, holding her closer. "No," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "I respected them, enjoyed their company, but I never loved. I never felt," he hesitated, "never felt what I feel for you." Sarah's heart raced. "And what do you feel for me?" "Something that scares me," he admitted. "Something that makes all my careful calculations, all my strategic plans irrelevant. Something that made me propose at the altar of a church without thinking of the consequences." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "David." "I love you, Sarah," he said simply, completely irrationally, in a way that has nothing to do with strategy or mutual benefits. "And if that scares you, I understand. But it's the truth." 6 months later, Sarah was at the office at the end of a particularly hectic day, organizing contracts for the new housing project in the East Side, when she came across a folder she didn't recognize on her desk. Inside were meticulously organized documents that made her heart stop. All the debts that Michael had created in her name were marked as settled, with bank stamps dated the week after their wedding. Further down, she found something even more surprising: documents establishing an investment fund in her name, fueled by retroactive bonuses from all the projects she had worked on over the past 5 years. The accumulated amount was substantial enough to buy her own house, pay off the education she was still financing, and still have a considerable reserve. "You shouldn't have seen this yet," said the familiar voice of David behind her. Sarah turned slowly, holding the documents with slightly trembling hands. "How long has this been going on?" "The debts? Since the 2nd week. The fund, since I started falling in love with you 3 years ago. I always planned to formally acknowledge your contributions, but He gestured vaguely. The circumstances became complicated. "David," Sarah said, her voice heavy with emotion, This must be a fortune." "It's recognition," he gently corrected, stepping closer to her. "It's what you've always deserved, regardless of our personal situation." Sarah studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or control, but found only the sincerity she had learned to recognize. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I wanted you to know that you can choose to be with me without being financially dependent on me. I wanted your decision to be free of any economic pressure." The irony of the situation hit her like a wave. "You're giving me financial independence so I can choose to leave you." "I'm giving you what has always been rightfully yours," he said firmly. "And yes, I want you to have the freedom to choose." Sarah placed the documents on the desk and walked to the office window, watching the bustling streets of New York in the late afternoon. The city pulsed below, a place of contrasts and possibilities, much like the life she had built over the past few months. "Do you know what's most interesting about all this?" she finally said, not turning around. "What?" "I had already decided." David fell silent, waiting. 3 weeks ago, when you spent the entire night at the hospital with me because I thought I had appendicitis, but it was just a kidney stone. You cancelled an important meeting the next day to make sure I was okay." She turned to face him. 2 weeks ago, when my mother came over for dinner and you spent 2 hours listening to her tell stories about my childhood, genuinely laughing at every embarrassing anecdote." Sarah took a step toward him. "Last week, when that difficult client tried to humiliate me in the meeting, you not only put him in his place, you made a point to publicly credit an idea of mine that had saved the project." "One more step. You know me, David. You know my fears, my quirks, my dreams. You see me as a person, not as an employee or a wife or any other role I play." Now she was very close to him, close enough to see the tiny lines around his eyes, the almost imperceptible scar on his eyebrow. "I love you," she said simply, "not because you saved me from humiliation, not out of gratitude or convenience or financial security. I love you because you make me want to be the best version of myself. Because when I'm with you, I feel valued in a way I've never experienced before." David's eyes filled with an emotion she rarely saw, relief, joy, and something deeper that made her heart race. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse, "are you sure? Because if we say this is real, if we assume this marriage is about love and not about convenience, then it will be real," she completed, "with all the complications, risks, and possibilities that it implies." David pulled her into his arms, and this time when they kissed, it wasn't the chaste and respectful kiss of the altar, but something intense and true that sealed a promise made not out of desperation or convenience, but by conscious choice and genuine love. When they separated, Sarah smiled, the genuine smile he had noticed years before that lit up the entire room. "So," she said, playfully fiddling with his tie, "how about we renew our vows, this time with the whole family, at St. Mary's Church, but for all the right reasons?" "With one condition," David replied, smiling back. "What?" "That this time, when the priest asks if we accept each other in joy and in sorrow, we truly know what we're answering." Sarah laughed, a free and happy sound that echoed through the silent office. "I do," she said, using the same words that had changed her life months before, but now filled with a completely new meaning. Down below, New York continued its frenetic pace, but on the 40th floor of a building on the east side, 2 people had finally found something that is rarely found. In the business world, a true love built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, genuine admiration, and the courage to choose happiness even when it comes wrapped in unexpected ways.